Happy Columbus Day, goons. As you can see from the title, this video is going to be about the smallpox blankets narrative. You know, the one the hyper-progressive left constantly shrieks about. If you're as unfortunate as I am to live in a hyper-left-wing city, then you're probably familiar with the conversations about this narrative and how it's just proof that the United States is a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy who sanctioned the genocide of the noble, didn't-do-nothing indigenous peoples' tribes. Because in cucked left-wing cities across the nation, these lunatics are recognizing today as Indigenous Peoples Day. As if we don't already show our appreciation and understanding of the Native American tribes through Native American History Month every single year. This little slice of revisionism by the ahistorical twats in America is just another axe swing at their iconoclastic push for cultural hegemony. So I'm going to explain to you all why the smallpox blanket story is total horseshit, step by step. Unfortunately, we're just going to have to move past Columbus, though, simply because his exploration of the New World and his subsequent interactions with the various native tribes is just far too complex, and I'm not going to jerk your chain and tell you that the Spanish explorers weren't brutal. I'm not going to tell you that they weren't enslaving and slaughtering resistant native Indians throughout the Caribbean and Central and South Americas, because they certainly were. Columbus was an explorer, and unfortunately these things were simply the reality of that time, just as it was throughout all of human history. Columbus founded the New World. He set Europe on the path to settle and colonize the Western Hemisphere. He wasn't a good man by modern standards, but that's irrelevant. We don't celebrate his brutality, we celebrate the fact that he undertook an exploration that would open the New World to the Old. It's important to recognize these things. Just like we don't celebrate Washington or Jefferson as slave owners, we celebrate their selfless contributions to our civilization, because without these men, and maybe even the circumstances they found themselves in regarding slavery, our history might have been devastating. And for all of you Leif Erikson cucks who are out crying about how Scandinavia actually founded the New World, let me just say that floating off the coast of Newfoundland for several years, hunting and fishing, leaving no discernible trace of your achievement, well, you just sound like underachievers. And you sound like crybabies. But back to the smallpox blankets. Let's start this lesson by explaining this was not sanctioned by the United States. This was actually colonial America under British rule. Most of these incidents occurred in the late 17th and mid-18th centuries, decades before the Revolutionary War. The most notable incidents occurred during the settlement at Jamestown and during the French Indian War. However, the Jamestown incident was rather an incident in which the English soldiers poisoned the Indians, then ambushed them following a peace offering of food and drink with the Indians. But more importantly, this Jamestown incident in 1623 occurred in retaliation to a Powhatan uprising which killed 350 English settlers. This was retribution. The incident during the French Indian War occurred in Fort Pitt, however, there is some dispute as to the actual conduct of the English. For instance, History.org cites official quotes from a British military officer named Sir Geoffrey Amherst. Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them. And later, Sir William Amherst said, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race." This was in reference to Chief Pontiac's siege at Fort Pitt in 1763, in which the Ottawa tribe completely sacked the fortress and slaughtered its inhabitants. In the wake of the siege, a local trader named William Trent claimed that after the British rebuffed two Indian chiefs' urge for the English to leave the fortress, the English gave them a handkerchief and 2 blankets from the smallpox hospital in hopes that it, quote, will have the desired effect. But these were more likely pieces of a greater tribute the English paid to the Indians to stop them from attacking, which included other provisions such as liquor. However, there's no evidence that this even worked, and there's an alternative theory that the Indians were actually infected as a result of their exposure to the people they were slaughtering in the smallpox hospital in the fortress. And John Coster theorized that the blankets were actually spoils of war which the Indians kept after their raid on the fort. Now, Coster further writes about the next well-known smallpox epidemic between 1837 and 1838. Again, he notes that this was not an actual state-sanctioned genocide, but rather a tragedy of errors involving Missouri tribes who not only warred, but also intermarried with American fur traders, and those fur traders carried smallpox and other diseases as well. The main tribes affected were Siouan-speaking Plain Indian tribes, the Mondans, the Arikaras, the Hidastas, the Lakotas, and the Blackfoot. The 5 civilized tribes Americans know quite well, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, were also affected, but not to the same degree as the former 5. The latter were infected during the execution of the Indian Removal Act. However, this was likely due to their exposure to beasts of burden, such as cattle and horses, or even the very soldiers conducting the march to Oklahoma. What's not being mentioned throughout all these horseshit narratives, though, is the fact that the Indians had vulnerably weak immune systems due to their remoteness. Jared Diamond talks about this in Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he cites the fact that European settlers had far hardier and rugged immune systems, the result of centuries of exposure to diseases and bacteria throughout Europe and the Old World, which they passed along to their children. And just so no one is under any delusions on the myth of the noble savage, even General William Tecumseh Sherman, a man who was no stranger to the brutality and violence of war, commented on the devastating violence of the Indians following the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer was massacred, when he said, quote, "Hostile savages like Sitting Bull and his band of outlaw Sioux must feel the superior power of the government." The Indians, just like the European settlers, were barbaric in war, but unlike the settlers, they were also barbaric in peace. Walter Bornemann even discusses their savagery towards each other in his book 1812, when he commented on how difficult Chief Tecumseh found it to unite the tribes in order to ally with the newly formed Republican armies against the British. Bornemann claimed Tecumseh's chief difficulty was uniting the Indians against what I can only interpret as their own bigoted hatred for all of the tribes. I'll leave links in the description of the various sources I've used, and I'll post this to my Orwell's Ghost page as well, since I'm going to be focusing that page on history, really just in an effort to make sure people don't cherry-pick facts or simply make up bullshit from whole cloth. The point of all of this is that America never engaged in any kind of state-sanctioned genocide against anyone. The Indian Death March to Oklahoma was brutal, but it was hardly a genocide. While the smallpox blanket story is largely unproven, or the surrounding events even agreed upon, Coster figures it probably killed only around 17,500 Indians, of which there were hundreds of thousands at the time. And even though he does claim that we could infer there was a, quote, cultural genocide, he doesn't really explain what that is, so I'm probably just going to chalk that up to rhetorical flourish. Before you start listening to some post-modern neo-Marxist twats sipping champagne and self-flagellating about white man bad and red bad... Before you start listening to some postmodern neo-Marxist twats sipping champagne and self-flagellating about white man bad and red man didn't do nothing, get out and read a book. America has darkness in its past, and we can recognize that, but we can also celebrate the great things it's done. Formed the most influential republic in world history, torn itself apart to free the slaves and abolish the slave trade, liberate Europe from conquest twice, and stop the spread of communism into the West. We can celebrate our achievements. So to all you uneducated twats who think you know better, Christopher Columbus, Andrew Jackson, and General Sherman did nothing wrong. And a happy Columbus Day.